Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video and leaving such heartfelt comments. Wishing the whole family good health and peace. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves at the top of the hill, Deep had already woken up early to feed the chickens and the dog. She gently scattered food for each animal, her eyes still filled with sadness from the previous day. Despite this, she smiled when she saw them happily eating, as if their joy eased some of the pain in her heart. Deep continued with her daily tasks, but the feeling of unease still clung to her. As she was walking out of the chicken coop, suddenly, a loud noise from the garden below startled her. She hurried down and saw a young man trying to climb James' pomelo tree but suddenly falling. His leg caught in a branch and bleeding. Deep quickly rushed over, helping him up. "Thank you," he said, his breath labored, his eyes showing panic. Deep saw the hardship in his eyes and couldn't leave him there hurt. She helped him to the city where he could receive care. "I'll repay you," he said when they stopped at a small coffee shop. Deep didn't care about his promise, but little did she know, it would become an inseparable part of her story later on. When Deep stepped out of the coffee shop, the young man followed closely, never taking his eyes off her. Deep could feel his attention, but it made her uncomfortable. She just wanted everything to be over soon. After he left, Deep felt like she had done the right thing, even though she still had some hesitation. She continued on to the hill to pick papayas, her heart heavy with the tasks ahead. Deep returned to the hill to pick papayas, a part of her plan to earn money. She skillfully picked each papaya and placed them in a sack to carry down to the city to sell. As she walked through the hill, a pregnant woman, who seemed to be a local resident, suddenly stopped and started talking to Deep. "Are you alone?" the woman asked, her voice gentle but with a hint of worry. Deep replied briefly, but inside she felt a bit flustered. The woman continued, "I see you working so hard like this. Why don't you find a good man to rely on? He could help you, and you could live a happier life." Deep stayed silent, the words echoing in her mind. After the conversation, Deep felt a shift in her thinking. She couldn't stop thinking about the woman's advice, and unintentionally, a new figure began to appear in her heart. A good man like James? Or the young man she had just met? Deep continued to carry the sack of papayas down to the city, but her heart was full of confusion. While she had made a decision to live independently, a part of her longed to be loved and cared for. The long journey from the hill to the city seemed heavier with her conflicting thoughts. When Deep arrived at the market, several locals and traders had gathered to buy the papayas, making her feel proud of the work she had done. She quickly sold all the papayas and earned a good amount of money to take home. At that moment, Deep thought again about the woman's advice and reminded herself that she needed to think carefully about the relationships around her. She couldn't keep running from the feeling of loneliness. James returned from the hill, holding a report, his heart heavy. For the past week, he had tried to resolve all the issues with the ginger garden, but failure was inevitable. The large investments were going down the drain, and he felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice. He sat down, looking at his phone but unable to answer any calls. Everything seemed to be collapsing around him. He sighed, full of worry. The images of Deep and the young man from earlier kept popping into his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about his life and his poor decisions, then berating himself for not seizing the opportunity. Meanwhile, Deep had sold all the papayas, earned a large sum of money, and felt proud of her work. She brought the money home, feeling lighter. When she walked in, James was still not back, but when he arrived, she couldn't help but notice the difference in his attitude. He didn't say anything, just nodded when he saw her. Deep smiled, but she didn't see the same care in his eyes as before. As she was cooking, the young man from earlier unexpectedly appeared at the door, casually asking about Deep. They chatted cheerfully, and Deep felt like he was showing real interest in her. They both smiled, but this made James uncomfortable. He just stood there watching from afar, his eyes filled with jealousy. A feeling of disappointment and anger surged within him. When James saw Deep and the young man smiling together, he felt uneasy. He walked over, his voice dry and threatening. "You're not who I thought you were." Deep flinched, and before she could react, the young man felt the tension and hurriedly left. James was angry but didn't express it outwardly. He quietly walked away without explaining anything. Deep hurriedly ran after him, but by the time she got close, James had already gotten into his car and left. She stopped, watching his figure fade into the distance, her heart feeling like it was being pierced by 1,000 knives. She sat by the roadside, unable to stop the tears that began to flow. Everything around her seemed to blur. She wondered if she was worthy of James's love. Why was she always caught up in unclear relationships like this? A sense of loneliness and isolation enveloped Deep, but she couldn't change anything. She could only sit and cry, hoping that someone would come to help her find a way out. James walked in, his eyes scanning over Deep and the young man. This scene was unbearable for him. He couldn't control the anger inside, especially seeing the two of them smiling together. He walked over, his voice dry and threatening. "You're not who I thought you were." Deep flinched, and before she could react, the young man felt the tension and quickly left. James was furious but didn't show it outwardly. He silently walked away without a word of explanation. Deep hurriedly ran after him, but when she got close, James had already gotten into his car and left. She stopped, watching his figure fade away, her heart feeling like it had been pierced by 1,000 daggers. She sat by the side of the road, unable to hold back the tears that were already flowing. Everything around her seemed to blur. She asked herself, "Am I worthy of James's love? Why do I always get caught in these unclear relationships?" A sense of loneliness and isolation enveloped Deep, but she couldn't change anything. All she could do was sit and cry, hoping that someone would come and help her find a way out. After a moment, Deep slowly stood up, not wanting to stay there any longer. She walked through the darkness, wondering if there was still a chance to fix everything. At that moment, a beam of light shone through the clouds, and Deep realized that life goes on, no matter how difficult it gets. She couldn't keep living in the past, couldn't keep being dragged by feelings of disappointment and hurt. Deep needed to stand firm and decide to move forward. Every step she took on this path was a confirmation of her own strength, but the worry still lingered when she saw James's figure in the distance. James entered the house, his gaze sweeping over Deep and the young man. He couldn't hold back his anger, especially seeing the two of them smiling together. He walked over, his voice dry and threatening. "You're not who I thought you were." Deep flinched, and before she could react, the young man quickly left, sensing the tension. James was furious, but he didn't express it outwardly. He quietly walked away without any explanation. Deep quickly ran after him, but when she got close, James had already gotten into his car and left. She stopped, watching his figure disappear into the distance, her heart feeling like it had been pierced by 1,000 knives. She sat by the side of the road, unable to hold back the tears that welled up. Everything around her seemed to blur. She wondered if she was worthy of James's love. Why did she always find herself caught up in relationships that were unclear? A feeling of loneliness and isolation enveloped Deep, but she couldn't change anything. She could only sit and cry, hoping someone would come and help her find a way out. While Deep sat crying by the side of the road, the young man suddenly came back and stopped in front of her. He bent down, gently patting her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice warm. Deep looked up at him but didn't speak, staying silent. He smiled again and asked, "Do you need someone to talk to?" Deep felt a bit comforted, but her heart still felt shattered. Eventually, she stood up and followed him for a short distance, wondering if she could ever open up again. But she couldn't deny the relief she felt having a stranger by her side during these difficult moments. Sadness still clung to Deep, even though she tried to appear strong. She realized that she couldn't keep living in pain and uncertainty about love. Deep decided to go outside, seeking a place where her soul could find peace. In the quiet of the forest, she sat under a large tree, breathing deeply and trying to clear her mind of all worries. She was tired of facing so many challenges, but she knew she couldn't give up. Suddenly, the phone rang. Deep picked it up. It was an old friend calling to check on her. She smiled faintly, talking about her current life and what had happened. "I'm fine, even though it's been tough at times," she said, but inside she felt stronger. The call ended and Deep stood up, feeling ready to face whatever was ahead, whether it was love or career. She would overcome it on her own. She turned back to the house, filled with renewed hope. When Deep got home, she saw James sitting alone in the living room, the soft light from the window casting a glow on his face. Deep walked over and sighed. "Can you tell me why you left?" James looked at her, his eyes filled with worry. I couldn't bear to see you smile with someone else, he said, his voice trembling. She smiled faintly. James, we have to learn to let go, and not hold on to relationships that bring us pain. James stayed silent, his eyes shimmering as if wanting to say more, but he couldn't. Deep stepped outside, her eyes looking up at the starry sky, softly reminding herself that a bright future was waiting for her ahead.
Một cách gọi thân mật hoặc một biệt danh dành cho một người phụ nữ lớn tuổi, có thể là bà ngoại, mẹ hoặc một người phụ nữ khác trong một gia đình hoặc cộng đồng, và bạn nói rằng cô ấy tốt bụng. Đó là một đặc điểm tuyệt vời của một người. Những người tốt bụng thường được mọi người yêu mến và tôn trọng vì luôn sẵn sàng giúp đỡ và chăm sóc người khác. Nếu bạn muốn nói thêm về bà mẹ của mình, tôi sẵn lòng lắng nghe. Bạn có thể chia sẻ thêm những việc tốt bụng mà cô ấy đã làm, hoặc những kỷ niệm đẹp mà bạn với cô ấy đã có. Bà mẹ của bạn đi chợ, đó là một hoạt động hàng ngày của nhiều người, đặc biệt là những người lớn tuổi. Tôi hình dung ra một hình ảnh ấm áp và thân thiện. Bà mẹ của bạn đi chợ, chọn lựa những thực phẩm tươi ngon và cần thiết cho gia đình. Cô ấy có thể sẽ gặp gỡ với nhiều người hàng xóm và bạn bè, trò chuyện với những chia sẻ với những tin tức mới nhất. Đi chợ cũng là một cách để bà mẹ của bạn giữ được sự hoạt động và độc lập, cũng như duy trì những mối quan hệ xã hội quan trọng. Bạn có thường đi chợ cùng bà mẹ không? Hay bạn có những kỷ niệm đặc biệt nào về những lần đi chợ cùng cô ấy không? Thấy ấm áp và thoải mái, những lời nói của cô ấy có thể mang lại cho bạn những cảm giác an toàn và được yêu thương. Tôi hình dung ra một người hình ảnh ấm áp, bà mẹ của bạn ngồi cạnh, nói chuyện với bạn về những điều quan trọng và kỷ niệm đẹp. Cô ấy có thể chia sẻ với bạn những câu chuyện quá khứ, những kinh nghiệm và những bài học quý giá. Khi bà mẹ của bạn nói, bạn có thể sẽ cảm thấy ấm áp và thoải mái, an toàn và được yêu thương, tôn trọng, ngưỡng mộ, hạnh phúc và biết ơn. Bạn có thể sẽ nhớ những lời nói của bà mẹ và áp dụng cho cuộc sống hàng ngày của bạn.